3 days before my wedding, my own mother sat me down at her kitchen table and asked me to erase the one man who raised me, and by the end of that week, a stranger in a navy dress would stand up in front of 200 wedding guests and say 4 words that would haunt my parents for the rest of their lives. So if you have ever been told that the person who loved you best simply was not good enough for polite company, stay with me to the end of this one, because what happened at my reception is the kind of moment that restores your faith in the idea that decency eventually gets its due. My name is Hannah Brooks, I am 28 years old, and this is the true story of my wedding week, the week my parents chose appearances over blood, and the week the universe quietly disagreed with them in front of everyone who mattered. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days out from the ceremony, when my mother called and asked me to come by the house to go over quote-unquote last-minute details, which in hindsight should have warned me, because my mother never used the phrase last-minute details unless she was preparing to detonate something. I remember the kitchen smelled like the vanilla candles she always burned when company was coming, even though it was just going to be the three of us, my mother, my father, and me. She poured herself coffee she never intended to drink, just something to stir while she worked up to whatever she had rehearsed in the mirror that morning. My father sat across from me with his arms crossed and his jaw already set in that particular way it got when a decision had already been made somewhere behind his eyes and all that remained was making me agree to it. He has a way of nodding along to whatever my mother says that makes it clear the two of them discussed this at length. Before I ever walked through the door, he is not a spontaneous man, my father. Everything he does is calculated, weighed, measured against how it will look to the people whose opinions he has spent his whole life chasing. My mother finally set her spoon down against the rim of the mug, a small clean click that somehow made the whole room go quieter, and she said the words I will remember until the day I die. She said, "He is a retired janitor, Hannah. He worked at a middle school for 30 years. Your father's business partners will be there. The Whitfields will be there. What are people supposed to think?" I actually sat there for a moment waiting for the joke, waiting for the punchline. Some part of me refused to believe that my own mother was sitting in her spotless kitchen asking me to remove my grandfather from the head table of my own wedding because of what his job used to be, but the joke never came. There was no punchline, there was only my father nodding along like this was simply logistics, like we were discussing seating charts for strangers instead of erasing the one person who had shown up for me every single day of my childhood. My father finally spoke, and his words landed like a verdict rather than an opinion. "He embarrasses us," he said, as if that settled the matter entirely, as if 4 words were sufficient justification to humiliate a 70-something-year-old man who had given every spare hour and every spare dollar he had to raising a granddaughter his own children were too busy to raise themselves. Something cracked open in my chest in that moment, hot and sharp, and it took everything in me not to scream, because in that instant every memory of my childhood came rushing back at once. My grandfather, Walter, was the reason I existed in any meaningful sense of that word. When my parents were consumed with climbing whatever social and financial ladder they had decided to find a successful life, it was Walter who picked me up from school every single day for 6 years straight, rain or shine, without ever once complaining that it interrupted his own plans. It was Walter who sat with me at his cramped little kitchen table until midnight, night after night, helping me study for exams for subjects he himself never got the opportunity to finish school long enough to take. It was Walter who quietly paid for my community college tuition directly out of his modest pension the year my parents claimed there simply was not enough money left over, even though somehow there was always enough money for my mother's designer handbags and my father's country club golf memberships that same year. He never once made his sacrifices feel like a burden he was carrying for me. He made me feel like I was simply worth it, plain and simple. No complicated math required. I looked at my parents sitting there in that pristine kitchen, surrounded by everything Walter's quiet decades of labor had helped make possible in some indirect way, and I said, calmly, "He is sitting at the head table, that is final." My mother's face went tight in the particular way it does when she is trying very hard to remain composed while internally furious. She said, "Hannah, be reasonable. This is not about love, it is about optics. You are marrying into a family with real standing. Do you understand what it will look like? A man in a rented suit who smells like a school hallway sitting next to the Whitfields." And something in me, some old ember of loyalty that had been quietly banked for years, finally caught fire. I told her, "He smells like peppermints." Because he keeps a bag of them in his pocket for kids who skin their knees on the playground. That is who he is. That is the man you are asking me to hide." My father exhaled sharply through his nose, the exact sound he makes when he has decided the negotiation phase of a conversation is officially over. He said, "We raised you better than this kind of sentimentality. Family events are about presentation. You know that." And something in me simply stood up, chair scraping loudly against the tile floor, and I said, "No, you know that. I know that my grandfather drove 2 hours round trip every single day for years so that I would never come home to an empty house after school. I know that he never once asked for anything back for any of it, and I know that if he is not welcome at the head table of my own wedding, then apparently neither am I." The room went completely silent except for the steady tick of the kitchen clock above the stove. My mother's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a single sound. My father looked at me the way you might look at a stranger who had somehow wandered uninvited into his home. "Fine," he finally said, his voice gone flat and cold in a way I had heard him use on business rivals but never once on me. "We will see how this plays out." I should have known right then that this was not the end of it. I should have recognized that particular tone as a promise rather than a surrender, but I left that kitchen believing, perhaps naively, that the worst of it was already behind me. 2 nights later came the rehearsal dinner, and the tension in that room was thick enough that my future mother-in-law, Diane, a warm woman with kind eyes who had welcomed me into her family without a single reservation from the very beginning, kept glancing over at me with quiet, unspoken concern. My fiancé Theo squeezed my hand under the table more than once that evening, a silent question passing between us each time. "Are you okay?" And each time I told him I was fine, though I am not entirely certain either of us fully believed it. My parents arrived late to their own daughter's rehearsal dinner, sat stiffly through the appetizer course, and barely exchanged more than a few clipped words with anyone at the table. The tension radiating off them was almost its own kind of centerpiece, when the wedding coordinator, a cheerful woman named Priya who had no idea she was about to walk into the middle of a family reckoning, began calmly walking the table through the finalized seating chart and confirmed, matter-of-factly, that Walter would indeed be seated directly beside me at the head table exactly as planned. My mother set her fork down against her plate with a small, sharp click that somehow echoed across that entire private dining room. "We need to speak with you," she said, "now," and something in her voice told me this was not a request. I followed my parents out into the hallway just outside the private room, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My father did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "If that man sits at the head table tomorrow," he said, "we will not be attending the wedding." I searched his face for even the faintest flicker of a bluff, some small sign that this was theater meant to scare me into compliance, but there was nothing. His eyes were flat and certain. This was not a threat, it was simply a statement of fact as he saw it. "Then do not come," I said, and I will be honest, the words left my mouth far steadier than I ever expected them to. My mother's eyes went glassy in that moment, though I suspect it was more from wounded pride and cold fury than from any genuine sadness. "You are choosing him over your own parents," she said. And I answered, "I am choosing decency over cruelty. There is a difference." And with that, my parents turned and walked out of the rehearsal dinner entirely, without saying goodbye to a single guest, without so much as a glance toward Walter, who sat quietly at the far end of the table sipping ice water and doing his level best to pretend he had not noticed the storm that had just rolled through the hallway barely 10 feet away from where he sat. When I finally returned to my seat beside him, hands still trembling slightly, he reached over and patted my hand gently, the way he had done 1,000 times throughout my childhood. "You did not have to do that for me," he said quietly, and I told him, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady, "Yes, I did." He did not say anything else after that. He simply squeezed my hand the exact same way he used to when I was 7 years old and terrified of thunderstorms, as though his grip alone had the power to hold the entire world steady. I had absolutely no idea, sitting there in that suddenly quiet dining room, that the real reckoning had not even begun yet. I had no idea that the very next day, at my own wedding reception, a woman none of us had ever met would walk directly up to my grandfather in front of every single guest in that barn, including several of my absent parents' most important business associates, and change everything with 4 words that not one person in that room would ever forget for as long as they lived. The morning of the wedding arrived warm and golden, exactly the kind of soft, glowing light that makes every single photograph look like it belongs framed in a magazine somewhere. I got dressed in the small preparation room behind the chapel with my hands trembling, though not from any nerves about marrying Theo, whom I had never once doubted for a single second, but from staring at the empty space in the front row where my parents should have been sitting. They did not come, not to the ceremony, not to watch me walk down the aisle, not to hear a single word of the vows I had spent weeks writing and rewriting late at night. Walter walked me down the aisle instead, his old dress shoes polished so carefully and so thoroughly that I could genuinely see my own reflection in the toes of them, his eyes wet and glistening the entire slow walk down. When the officiant asked the traditional question of who gives this woman to be married, Walter's voice came out strong, clear, and unmistakably proud. "Her grandfather does," he said, "with everything I have." I cried through roughly half of the ceremony after that, though I want to be clear these were good tears, the kind that come only from finally feeling, in your bones, that the people who genuinely loved you were the ones standing right there beside you when it mattered most. The reception itself was held in a beautifully restored old barn venue just outside of town, strings of warm white lights crossing back and forth overhead, long banquet tables dressed in crisp white linen, the smell of fresh flowers and wood smoke drifting through the open barn doors. Walter sat exactly where he belonged that evening, right beside me at the head table, looking just a touch uncomfortable in his rented suit but sitting up a little straighter and a little prouder every single time another guest stopped by to shake his weathered hand and thank him for something kind he had done for them or their children years earlier. Because it turned out half the room had a Walter story of their own, small quiet kindnesses accumulated over 3 decades of mopping floors and fixing broken lockers. About an hour into the dinner service, I noticed a woman I did not recognize moving through the crowded room with a quiet, unmistakable sense of purpose. She looked to be somewhere in her early 60s, silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly, dressed in a sharply tailored navy dress that immediately signaled she was not simply another distant cousin or plus one. Theo leaned in close and whispered that her name was Margaret Ellison, the chief executive of the logistics firm his own father worked for, and that he genuinely had no idea she had even been invited. She must have received the invitation through the firm's usual channels, he guessed. I felt my stomach tighten almost immediately, because Margaret Ellison ran one of the largest logistics companies in the entire state, and I knew from years of my father's offhand comments at dinner parties that he had spent the better part of his career quietly trying to impress her. If there was precisely one single person on this earth my parents had been utterly terrified of embarrassing themselves in front of, it was unquestionably Margaret Ellison, and she was standing in this barn, at my wedding, walking with clear intention straight toward the head table. She did not stop to greet Theo first, she did not stop to greet me first, she walked directly up to Walter, stopped in front of his chair, and extended her hand toward him with an expression that made the entire surrounding table fall silent almost instantly. "Walter Brooks," she said, and something in the particular way she said his name made it clear this was not a chance encounter. "I do not know if you remember me." Walter squinted up at her for a long moment, clearly confused, and then, quite suddenly, his eyes went wide. "Maggie," he said, "Maggie Ellison, good Lord, it has been 41 years. She smiled at that, her carefully composed professional polish cracking just slightly into something far warmer and more human. The tables closest to us had gone completely silent by this point, guests turning in their seats to watch this unexpected reunion unfold. Margaret pulled a nearby chair close and sat down right beside my grandfather as though they were old, dear friends reuniting after decades apart, because as it turned out, that is precisely and exactly what they were. "Walter was the janitor at Redwood Elementary School," she said, her voice carrying now, loud enough for half the barn to hear clearly. "I was 11 years old, and my father had just lost his job. We did not have money for lunch some weeks we barely had money for much of anything at all. I used to hide in the supply closet near the gymnasium so that none of the other kids would see me not eating during lunch period." Her voice caught slightly there, just for a moment, before she continued. "Walter found me there one afternoon, hiding among the mop buckets and stacked textbooks, and he never once said a single word about it to me or to anyone else. Every single day for 2 full years after that, he quietly left a sandwich and an apple sitting on the shelf exactly where I hid. He never made me feel small or ashamed for needing it, he never once drew attention to it. I only found out years later that it had been him all along, Because another teacher accidentally let it slip long after I had already graduated and moved away. The entire room had gone completely and utterly still by this point. I looked over at my father's conspicuously empty seat at the head table and felt my throat tighten painfully. Margaret turned fully toward my grandfather then, took his weathered, careworn hand gently in both of hers, and said the 4 words that would ripple through that entire barn that evening, and would eventually ripple through nearly every conversation my parents would have for months and months afterward. "You saved my life," she said, simply, plainly, and with absolute conviction. Audible gasps rippled outward through the nearby tables almost immediately. Someone near the back of the barn started clapping, quietly at first, and then the applause spread and grew until nearly half the room was on its feet. Walter, this quiet, unassuming man who had spent 30 patient years mopping floors, fixing broken lockers, and slipping peppermints into the pockets of crying children, sat there completely stunned, his eyes brimming with tears, entirely unprepared for the wave of recognition and gratitude closing in around him from every direction. "I run a company with over 400 employees now," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly running just beneath the surface of every word. "I have personally built scholarship programs over the years specifically for kids in exactly the situation I once found myself in, and none of it, ever happens without one quiet janitor who simply noticed a hungry child and decided, on his own, without any expectation of ever being thanked, to do something about it." I thought about my parents in that exact moment. About the word they had used just days earlier in that spotless kitchen, embarrassing, and I thought about how they were not in that barn to witness a woman who ran a company far larger and more successful than my father had ever managed to build in his entire career, publicly crediting her entire life's trajectory to the very man they had tried so hard to hide from view. I later heard, through a cousin who still spoke to my parents occasionally, that word of exactly what had happened at that reception reached my father within the week, and that his face reportedly went visibly pale when he finally learned precisely which 4 words Margaret Ellison had spoken that evening, and precisely who had been standing there among the crowd to witness every single one of them. My grandfather never once needed any of this vindication, not really. He never thought of himself as someone who needed to be ashamed of anything to begin with. He simply lived quietly and kindly and expected absolutely nothing in return for any of it. But I will admit, some small, stubborn part of me was deeply grateful that the universe handed him that particular moment anyway, in front of exactly the people who had once decided he was not good enough to sit among them. If this story moved you even a little, if you have ever had someone in your life who loved you quietly and without conditions while the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally treated that love as an inconvenience, I would love to hear about them in the comments below. And if you want more real stories like this one, stories about quiet kindness eventually finding its way back around, make sure you are subscribed to this channel so you never miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.